Well, how's everybody doing tonight? I want to welcome everyone to Canyon Creek Church. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Pastor Brandon. I am the lead pastor of the church. I want to apologize up front for two things. You might have heard that like a month ago, I got sick for the first time in 10 years, and I'm still wrestling through it, so my voice is kind of coming and going. So I'm going to try to power through today. Also, I'm not really proud of myself about this, but 3 days ago, I was putting on a pair of socks and threw my back out. So when you begin to hear this message today, you'll understand what a challenge that is from the very beginning to throw your back out. So I'm asking for maybe a little bit of grace, and the amazing thing is this is being recorded and it'll be available for the next 20 years for people to mock me in these moments. But you've joined us. It's not my voice cracking. I've made it through puberty. You've joined us in the middle of a series called Stranger Things. And what we are looking at is some of the extremes that God will go to get our attention. Now, what I hope you understand is that sometimes God will go to these massive extremes because you don't know him. And he's trying to get you to notice him so that you can realize how much he loves you and what can happen if you have a relationship with him. So for some of you here, God is trying to get your attention because you've never known him before. And then there's others of you, he's trying to get your attention because you've known him, you've gone to church, but there came a point in your life you decided you liked living your own way, and you started to do your own thing. And what God is doing is he's trying to get your attention so you realize that if you continue down the path that you are choosing, it could cause you an extraordinary amount of pain in the future. So God will go to these great extremes to get our attention. And I want to tell you that he does it simply because he loves us. And sometimes what God will do is he will do some things that don't make sense. Now, I don't know how long you've been following Jesus, and I don't know if you've had moments in your life where God has done something that didn't make sense to you, where God didn't answer a prayer that maybe you thought he should, or maybe God said yes to something that you thought he should say no to. Maybe there was a moment you thought God should move, but instead, he did nothing. He was silent. You are going to find that the longer you walk with Jesus, the more you will see God will do things that don't make sense. And then I'll also tell you this, that not only will he do things that doesn't make sense, but he will ask you to do things that doesn't make sense. I don't know if that's ever happened to you before, where God has asked you to do something that wasn't logical to you, wasn't comfortable to you. Sometimes God will ask you to do something that is way out of your comfort zone. So I want to give you the setting of where we're at today. Grab your Bible, turn to the book of Ezekiel. Can you hand me that water bottle, Brandon, that is right there? Thank you. So we are going to look at Ezekiel chapter 5, but I want to give you the setting of everything that's taken place up to this point. The book of Ezekiel takes place during the Babylonian exile. Now, I explained to you several weeks ago what the Babylonian exile was. The Babylonian exile is that time in history where Nebuchadnezzar was leading the Babylonians, and he went into Israel and he conquered Israel. But because he wasn't able to take all of the Israelites all the way back to Babylon, he did what was called selective deportation. He chose the social leaders, the economic leaders, the spiritual leaders in Israel, and he literally kidnapped them. 48,000 of them. And he brought them all the way back to Babylon, which, by the way, would be present-day Iraq. So they were brought there, and they were held in captivity against their will for over 40 years. Now, this was allowed to happen by God because the people of Israel had rebelled against God. They turned against him. And so God was trying to get their attention. And sometimes God is trying to get our attention, not because he wants to reveal himself to us, but because he wants to remind us that if we continue to live this way, it is going to dramatically affect our lives in a negative way. And he will go to extremes to get our attention. So even though God allowed the Israelites to be in this very difficult situation, he loved them. And he still wanted to give them hope. And in the middle of all of this, he called a man by the name of Ezekiel into service. And I shared with you a couple weeks ago what the Israelites would do every day is they would go down to the river Euphrates and they would worship and pray to God at the river. And they would do that at the river because they believed that God was present where there was living, flowing water. And they would do this on a regular basis every single day, similar to when they were in Jerusalem and they would go to the temple to pray. They would go to this river to pray. And several years into Ezekiel's captivity, he gets this vision from God. And this vision gets his attention. I mean, it is so extreme. He sees a storm rising up. He sees wind blowing, thunder, lightning, fire. And immediately, Ezekiel thinks, that must be God. Have you ever been in a moment where you were convinced, must be God? And this was that moment. I mean, there was no denying. I joked that he was either on a full-on acid trip or this was God. It was like one extreme or the other. And he knew this must be God. I like to say that each one of us will have a moment in our spiritual life. I call it our aha moment, where we're just absolutely convinced that it goes beyond our faith. I mean, this is something that is real. We had an encounter with God. It was real, where we had that must be God moment. And in the middle of this must be God moment, God calls Ezekiel into service. And he says, Ezekiel, I'm going to use you to talk to the Israelites. And he shares with them what the theme of his message is. So first he says, who you are is you are going to be a watchman. And I explain this. And a watchman is someone who is meant to guard, protect, warn, and correct. If you are a parent, God has called you to be a watchman over your family. We are called as followers of Jesus to be a watchman over our community, in our neighborhood. Like, we need to be there to help. So he says, you are a watchman. And he says, and here is what you are going to say. So here's the theme of your message. And he gives him 3 words: lament, mourning, and woe. And if you were me, you would think, that is not a message I want to preach on a regular basis. He basically says, I've called you into ministry, Ezekiel. Until you die, you're going to preach one sermon. Lament, mourning, woe. That's it. There's your message. And you would think, no one's bringing me in to preach. Like, no one's having me be their guest speaker. Lament, mourning, woe. So this is who you are. This is what your message is. But here's how I want you to deliver it. The campus pastors did a really good job illustrating this, so I'm going to go off of what they did. So, have you ever heard of the phrase prop comic? Prop comic? As best I can figure out, the first prop comic that ever, started using props in his comedy is a guy by the name of Gallagher. Anybody ever heard of Gallagher? So I remember when I was a kid, I was delighted by Gallagher because he didn't just talk, he used a prop. Remember what his prop was? A gargantuan watermelon. He would just put a watermelon there. I don't know what he said. I don't know if he was funny or not. I just knew it was hilarious when he smashed the watermelon. Watermelon went everywhere. You'd laugh. That was him. And he was funny because no one else did this. I mean, we're thinking, that's not very creative. He smashed a watermelon, but he was the first one to do it. So many of you know that I go to Las Vegas a lot, and there's a prop comic in Vegas who I've probably seen 20 times because all you have to do is walk through the mall and they give you free tickets to his show. He's a guy by the name of Carrot Top. Any of you heard of Carrot Top? So if you go to Carrot Top's show, by the way, I am in no means recommending Carrot Top's show. So if you visit Vegas, don't think, Pastor Brandon said to go to Carrot Top. No, I did not. So Carrot Top will roll out with this huge bin, and then he'll start pulling out one prop after another, and he'll start making jokes with the little props. And you laugh because the props are funny. Now, I actually think the very first prop comic ever was Ezekiel. Ezekiel used props long before anyone else was using props. We just don't give him credit. I also wouldn't really say he's a comic because he wasn't really funny. But if we saw somebody doing this on the street today, we would think it was pretty funny. So, again, the campus pastors explain this. So the Lord says to Ezekiel, I want you to illustrate to the Israelites the years of their sin. They sinned for 430 years, and I want you to illustrate it for them. And he said this, he said, I want you to go set up camp in the middle of the city, like where everyone can see you. I was actually thinking, I live in Mill Creek and go to the mall often, and there is a homeless guy who is right at the corner of Ashway and 164th. He's there all the time. And I actually look forward to seeing this guy sometimes. I always give him money because one week he's dressed like Santa Claus. The next week he's playing his guitar and singing. Sometimes he's drunk. Sometimes he's just standing there yelling at cars randomly. I find him fascinating. But you always see him because he's always there and it's a busy road. Okay? So set up in the busiest part where all the people can see you. And he says, the first thing I want you to do is take some clay, and I want you to mold it into the city of Jerusalem. He said, once you've done that, then I want you to lay siege to it. Then I want you to take a pan, and I want you to separate yourself from that little destroyed clay figure you made. Then I want you to lay on your left side for 390 days. And then after you're done with 390 days, then I want you to switch to your right side and lay on it for 40 days. So that is to illustrate the 430 years that Israel sinned. You are going to lay on one of your sides for 430 days. Well, the next thing he says, you also have to eat on this camping trip. So I don't want you to eat a lot. I want you to eat just a little bit of bread and drink a little bit of water. And he said, I want you to cook the bread over poop. Literally what he said. Ezekiel was like, hey, I'm willing to do just about everything, but the cooking over my own poop, I kind of draw the line at that. And so God makes an exception, says, all right, you can do it over cow poop. And Ezekiel's like, all right, I'm in for the cow poop. Okay, so that's it. For 430 days, he eats bread and drinks water that he cooked over cow dung. 430 days, he does this. What the campus pastors didn't mention is that he wasn't allowed to talk during any of this. So all of this happened in complete silence. So I want you to picture being the Israelites. You're there, you're watching all of this happening. I actually think the best way for me to illustrate how awkward this must have been is to demonstrate it for you in silence. Okay? The first thing I want to do is I want to honor the artwork that Morgan did. So, Morgan, will you hand me this great piece of art? It took Morgan 3 hours to make this little Lego city. So, because I don't want to make a clay version of Jerusalem, here is a Lego city that Morgan did. I want to point out that there is a little Lego figure that does not represent Morgan because he has lots of hair. Right. So we'll pretend like this is Ezekiel after laying out for 430 days and his hair just continuing to grow. So let me illustrate for you Ezekiel's camping trip, kind of fast forwarded what it must have been like. This took place for 430 days. He did this, and the people were just fascinated and watched. Are you with me? Yep. 430 days. Not a word. I think of how fascinated I am by the guy up on 164th. I can't imagine what the people thought. I wonder if they thought he was crazy. I wonder if they were trying to figure out what is this supposed to mean? I wonder what happened the first time he actually took time to make a clay version of Jerusalem. And then they're like, that is impressive. Have you ever seen somebody make an epic sandcastle? Have you seen somebody spend days making an epic sandcastle and then immediately destroy it? Now, that would be the weird part. You're thinking, no, as he lays siege to it. Sometimes God will ask you to do something that doesn't make sense. Sometimes God will do something that doesn't make sense. All of this so far, Ezekiel was cool with. Like, this was a little bit extreme, but he was obedient. And he, did what God asked him to do. And that was one of the things the campus pastors emphasized was Ezekiel's radical obedience to God. But then we go to chapter 5. What I need to emphasize with chapter 5 is before all of this happened, before this happened, God had shared with him chapter 5. So he had basically said, here's what I want you to do. Then after the 430 days, he's still not able to speak yet. I want you to do this. And here's what it is. Now, Son of Man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. Okay, verse 2. He says, when the days of your siege come to an end, here's what I want you to do with your hair. Okay, I don't understand the beard craze today. I mean, guys are obsessed with their beards. Most of the time, women aren't obsessed with guys' beards, but guys are obsessed with them. Guys are so obsessed with their beards, they talk about their beards. They hashtag about their beards. They have groups of friends that simply exist for their beards. There's not another part of the human body that we do that with. We don't have a nose club. We don't have a group of us that get together and we talk about our epic eyebrows. No, it's the beard. Guys are obsessed with their beards. And what you might not know is long before, caveman were into their beards and mountain men were into their beards and Duck Dynasty was into their beards and now hipsters were into their beards. Long before that, rabbis and Hasidic Jews were into their beards. And I know today, the motto is bald is beautiful. But back then, massive hair was a sign of beauty. In fact, they believed that your hair was like a symbol of your glory. And then Hasidic Jews believed that the longer the beard, the more holy the man. In fact, the Torah said you were not to shave your beard. So they would just occasionally use scissors and trim their beard. You've probably seen pictures of Jewish rabbis, and they have this little curly-Q side beard thing that goes all the way down. It's called a payat, and they would never cut it. And the longer it was, the more spiritual the man. In fact, to a Jewish rabbi, a beard is viewed as attractive, and it is beautiful. So you're Ezekiel. God is asking you to do crazy things. And now he's asking you to shave your beard. I can picture it. I would be like, God, willing to cook over poop, willing to not talk, but don't mess with the beard. Especially after 430 days of just laying there. I mean, his beard was epic. But God tells him, you need to grab a sword and shave it off. And then he says, here's what you are to do with it. He says, I want you to take part of it, and I want you to tuck it into your belt. Then I want you to take a third of it, and I want you to throw it into the fire, the hair. Then take another third, and I want you to grab a sword and scatter it around the city with a sword. And then I want you to take another third of the hair, and I want you to let it blow away in the wind. Now, God is asking him to do some crazy things. I wanted, for the sake of this message, to do an illustration where somebody shaved their beard. And when I'm telling how big of a deal this was, I could not find anyone to agree to do it. I'm saying Jesus wants you to shave your beard. And they're saying, I'm not doing it. I mean, some of the ugliest beards I've ever seen, men refuse to let their beards be shaved. But I finally was able to convince someone to let me shave his beard. Watch this. I have in this handy bag Billy Brown beard hair. So what Ezekiel was supposed to do take some of the beard hair and stow it away. So he took some in his pocket. Then he was to take some, a third, he scaled, weighed it out, took some and he tossed it into the fire and it burned. Then he took some and he put it on the ground. Remember, all this is happening in silence. Grabbed a sword. It was a sword similar to this. This is actually a Roman sword, but I couldn't afford a Babylonian sword, so we get the Roman sword. And then he took it and he did this. I'm destroying the floor. Just kept spreading it all around. And then the part you're going to love the most. Took the other third, and he let it blow in the wind. So I'll blow it at Morgan. No, just kidding. This was to illustrate God's judgment on the people of Israel. So what Ezekiel was doing, he laid on his side to illustrate the 430 years that Israel sinned. And then the hair was meant to illustrate God's judgment. Here's what it was meant to illustrate. A third that was burned in the fire was meant to illustrate that a third of the Israelites would die by a plague or famine. The third that was scattered by the sword was meant to illustrate that a third of the Israelites would die by sword outside the city. And then the third that was scattered in the wind was to illustrate that another third would never step foot in the city again and would spend their entire life running away from men chasing them with swords. And then he took that little small amount and he tucked it in to illustrate that there would be a small remnant of people that God would spare. That was his message. The end of chapter 5, and really a lot of chapter 5, and I hope you read it, it really is God kind of detailing what's going to happen to the Israelites. But in verse 13 it says, "Then finally, after all of this, my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal." You see, God will go to extreme lengths to get our attention. But he does it because he loves us. But sometimes God will ask us to do things that don't make sense. Sometimes he'll ask us to do things that are way out of our comfort zone. Sometimes God will put us in positions that we don't want to be in. Sometimes God will tell us to go where we don't want to go, stay when we don't want to stay. Sometimes he'll tell us to say what we don't want to say, be silent when we want to speak. There will be times that we want to see God do something great through us, and God will say, "But I want you to stay on the sidelines." But what do you do when God asks you to do something that doesn't make sense? How do you respond when God is working in your life, but it doesn't make sense? I want to close tonight just by sharing this with you. I think there are 4 things you need to realize when something doesn't make sense that God is trying to do in your life. 4 things. Number 1, you need to realize that I am not my own. 1 Corinthians 6:19, verse 20 says, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. I think one of the things that is interesting to me is people love serving Jesus until God asks them to do something that is uncomfortable. People love serving God until he does something that is contrary to what they want to do. But there are often times God is going to ask you to do something that doesn't make sense. And in those moments, you need to step back and you need to remember that I am not my own. There are so many times that as a minister, I have to remind myself that when I said, Lord, I want to preach the gospel for the rest of my life, I was literally telling the Lord, these are your hands, these are your feet, this is your mouth. I will go where you want me to go. I will say what you want me to say. I will serve however you want me to serve. And there are times I felt like God was telling me to take a demotion. There were times where I wanted to lead, but I felt like God was telling me to serve and follow. There's so many times God is going to ask you to do things that don't make sense. And in those moments, you need to remind yourself that I am not my own. Number two, you need to realize that God's way is not your way. Isaiah 55:8, prophet Isaiah said, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." Now I will bet you this. When Ezekiel got called into ministry, I bet he didn't have a clue that that was going to be the end result of his ministry. And what he was going to do is literally humiliate himself for a year and a half. Did you know that taking the sword and shaving your head, that sword was meant to illustrate God's judgment, and that the shaving of the head and the beard was meant as humiliation? So God was literally telling Ezekiel, I want you to humiliate yourself for me. If I was Ezekiel, I'd say, that doesn't make sense. Lord, there's probably a way better way to communicate what you want to communicate than me acting like an idiot in silence for a year and a half. But God's way isn't our way. I mean, there's things that we have done as a church that God has led us to do that at the time that we did it didn't make a lot of sense. Now that we have the benefit of hindsight, it makes a lot of sense. But God's way is not our way. Number three, what do you need to realize when God does something that doesn't make sense? That you need to not try to understand. Don't try to understand it. Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding. Did you know that your mind is finite? It doesn't know all. That there are things that God will ask you to do that you may never be able to wrap your brain around. There is times that God will say, I want you to quit your job and do this instead. And you will step back and say, God, that doesn't make sense. I don't understand how that will work. I just met with someone today who has a degree in theology. That's it. He has a theology degree, but he is right now an engineer. I mean, if you would have told him at the very beginning, you're going to go get a theology degree, but actually function as an engineer, that doesn't make sense. Don't try to understand all the time what God is doing. Sometimes God just wants you to be obedient right now. And that was the thing for Ezekiel. God was saying, Ezekiel, I just want you to trust me. I know it doesn't make any sense, but thousands of years later, people are going to be telling your story. I know it doesn't make sense now. I bet Ezekiel, when he got called to preach, thought, I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to hold papers and talk. What he didn't know is God is thinking for thousands of years, people have been talking that way, and it still hasn't gotten through the Israelites' heads. I want you to do something different that you don't understand. And what's really difficult is when God asks you to do something that no one's ever done before. As far as you know, no one's done. And we don't understand it. You're not always going to understand. And finally, what do you need to realize? Number one, you are not your own. Number two, God's way is not your way. Number three, don't try to understand. And number four, know that any time is a good time to rejoice. What I mean by that is Romans 8:18. Paul said it this way. He said, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Now, when do you think that Ezekiel got tired of laying on his left side? I was thinking, have you ever seen those studies that have happened about people that get stuck in their bed and they can't leave? You know, they start developing these sores on themselves. And, you know, when did Ezekiel start getting sores on his left side? When did he get an itch that made him want to roll over? You know, when did it all of a sudden happen? But the entire time, God is saying, I want you to trust me. And no matter what you're facing, what you're going through, any time is a good time to rejoice. One of the first verses that I ever memorized was in James. And it says, consider it pure joy. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. I always would say, whenever I was in the middle of that, quoting that verse in my head, I would say, Lord, I don't want to learn perseverance right now. But any time is a good time to rejoice. So what do you do when God asks you to do something that doesn't make sense? Never forget, you are not your own. Never forget, God's way is not my way. Don't try to understand. And even in the midst of it, you can still rejoice. I want to ask everyone to bow your heads and close your eyes.